내 차가 더러워질까봐 우리나라에 버렸습니다. 내 집에 냄새가 날까봐 우리나라에 버렸습니다. 내 배낭이 무거워질까봐 우리나라에 버렸습니다. 내 돈 드는 게 아까워 우리나라에 버렸습니다.
당신은 부끄럽지 않게 대한민국을 외칠 수 있습니까? 공익광고협의회.
All across America are traces of the arms race. A lost world of laboratories, reactors, and testing grounds built to produce the most destructive weapons in the history of mankind. This world existed to keep Americans safe, but it was hidden from their eyes. It was the product of the country's greatest minds, the most complex construction project the world has ever seen. And for 40 years, it was kept secret.
We had thousands of people working on the construction of this plant, and yet none of them could really know what was going on.
Nearly 20 years after the end of the Cold War, our investigators are finally able to enter these sites and explore the technology that built the bomb. They'll stand in the heart of the first nuclear power plant ever constructed. They'll see how an entire city was built to make it happen. They'll see evidence of the awesome power unleashed by a nuclear explosion.
The purpose of this test was to answer a very basic question. How big a hole can we make with a nuclear weapon?
And they'll gain access to the place where the Third World War could have begun.
25 minutes from now, Target 2 is a smoking hole.
They'll recreate the lost world of America's secret A-bomb factories. (1942). Scientists in the US and Germany raced to harness the deadly power of nuclear energy. In a breakthrough for America, the physicist Enrico Fermi created a plutonium chain reaction in his laboratory. And suddenly, the A-bomb was no longer just a theoretical possibility. The Manhattan Project followed. Then, over the next 40 years, the US would spend close to $1 trillion on its nuclear weapons program. Now, our investigators are going to unlock the secrets of America's nuclear factories. What was done here was revolutionary. Beverly Gage is a Yale professor and an expert in 20th century American history. She wants to find out exactly what the military built and how they managed to keep their program secret.
I have to say, nothing that I've seen in books or in photographs actually prepared me for what it's like to stand here and look at this massive hole.
David Bradshaw is an engineer fascinated by atomic history.
My goodness.
He wants to understand how it happened, to enter a world which continually pushed back the frontiers of technology.
This is a 9 megaton hydrogen bomb capable of being delivered 5,000 miles away with an accuracy of a few city blocks.
In October 1942, the government requisitioned an area of land in Hanford, Washington state. A facility would be built here dedicated to the production of plutonium. And 640 square miles of farmland would be given over to the most highly classified operation of World War II. It became one of the biggest secrets on Earth. Beverly meets Michelle Gerber to find out how.
We are standing here looking out over this remarkable landscape here, and what are we seeing in front of us?
Well, everything you see, the entire horizon, everything you see is the World War II Hanford Engineer Works.
So why was this site, of all sites, selected for that very, very particular purpose?
This site had the criteria that were absolutely perfect for the needs of the World War II Manhattan Project. First of all, the Columbia River. Everyone came here throughout history because of the river. the Hanford Engineer Works came here because the river is so powerful. It could deliver cooling water to the reactors, and it could power through steam generation all of the needs of this massive site.
But it wasn't just the river. The architects of the project knew that they were attempting something untried and highly dangerous. The hills that surround the site form a protective natural barrier. If something went wrong, the population might be shielded from the worst. Before Hanford became a secret city, it was home to 1,500 farmers. They had to be cleared out. Their world too is lost. This high school dates back to 1916. It's been empty for more than 60 of its 90 years. And the land it stands on is still restricted.
Behind me is Hanford High School, which is all that remains of the village of Hanford. This building went up in 1916, and as you can see, it's a pretty substantial structure. It drew in students from the surrounding community. When the government came in 1942, everyone in these communities, all of them were told they had 30 days to get off their land. Many of them were compensated, but not particularly well.
And so Hanford's new population moved in. Records say they came from more than 700 towns across America. Within a few months, they numbered in excess of 51,000. What they were engaged in was one of the biggest construction projects of all time. In 15 months, they used 160 million feet of lumber. They poured 784,000 tons of concrete. They laid 153 miles of railroad and 326 miles of highways. They built 7 power plants. For the duration of the project, all of the workers were housed in a temporary camp. Beverly and Michelle have come to see what traces they can find of it.
These are the barracks, is that?
That's right. We had 800 barracks here, and they would be fanned out in this area for about 3 miles along the river. And in the very first summer, the summer of 1943, some people even had to live in army tents.
Hanford Construction Camp was designed to be a regular community, albeit on a massive scale. Meals were taken in communal mess halls, which seated thousands. The site bakery made up to 20,000 pies a day. An auditorium to seat 5,000 provided entertainment. And the site even had its own baseball teams.
All of a sudden you have 51,000 people, and 47,000 of those are grown men. So there was probably more gambling, a little more drinking than you would have in a normal community.
Larry Denton remembers life in the camp 60 years ago.
There would be people in the streets stretched out blankets, playing craps and gambling, and start drinking beer. And of course that led to disagreements, and they'd get out of control once in a while. I witnessed a few times that they had to call in the fire department with their fire hoses and quiet things down.
After 18 months, when the job was done and the key technical buildings were finished, the workers moved out and the camp was razed to the ground. Today, there is virtually no sign of what stood here 6 decades ago.
I'm walking along the outline of a building that once stood here at the Hanford Construction Camp, and as you can see, there's almost nothing here today. The only hints that this was ever a thriving community of 51,000 people are what we see here, an outline of a building in the dirt or a post hole in the ground.
We can rebuild the camp as it looked at its height. It sprung up in 3 months and was gone 18 months later. But it comprised hundreds of buildings and the largest trailer park in history. At the local museum, David finds out what living conditions were like back then.
This Vagabond brand trailer was one of nearly 3,600 brought to the construction camp. Although simple in appearance, for 25,000 families, a trailer like this was considered home, often personalized with a picket fence. However, with no bathrooms, air conditioning, and only a simple radio for entertainment, it was a primitive luxury indeed.
Secrecy was vital. The truth about what was happening at Hanford could not be allowed out. Consequently, very few people really knew what they were involved in.
I had no idea what we were working on. We just assumed that it was something to do with explosives. And who would imagine the kind of explosive we were really making?
Just a few ounces of plutonium were needed to make a bomb, but production would cost hundreds of millions of dollars and demand the mobilization of a massive workforce. Next, the construction of the world's first nuclear reactor. Our investigators are in Hanford, Washington. They've discovered evidence of the top secret town built here in World War II for 51,000 workers. They came to develop the infrastructure needed to create a plutonium-fueled bomb. 554 technical buildings were constructed here during the war, but of all of them, this building was perhaps the most important. It was called the B reactor. In the race to develop a workable nuclear bomb, scientists had come up with the implosion design. The theory was that by using high explosives to force a core of plutonium in on itself, they could trigger a massive and devastating nuclear blast. They calculated that 9 pounds of plutonium would have to be manufactured. The process would be hazardous, incredibly labor-intensive, and entirely without precedent. It was the job of the B reactor. Construction began in 1943.
There were really three main challenges that faced the engineers building this reactor. The first was simply how quickly it was going to have to go up. The second challenge was that in some sense, they didn't really know what they were doing. Nobody had ever done anything like this before, and so to some degree you were kind of making it up as you went along. And the third big challenge was the challenge of secrecy, that you had thousands of people working on the construction of this plant, and yet none of them could really know what was going on.
The stakes were high. If the engineers had their calculations correct, they would be within reach of producing a functional bomb. Today, much of the reactor is off limits, but we've been given special access. David Bradshaw meets engineer Bob Egg to find out how it was designed to work. They start their investigation at the front face, where the fuel was loaded.
This is an incredibly complex looking machine. What did the physicists and scientists hope to do here?
David, their original concept was to convert natural uranium, which is basically found in the ground, into a new man-made material called plutonium-239. Then you'd take the natural ore that occurred in nature, and you'd bring it in, refine it a little bit, and then you'd make billets out of it and form it into a fuel element. And this is the fuel elements that basically would go inside of this reactor core.
Okay, so this slug went into the face of this reactor.
Placed in close proximity to each other, these fuel elements would start a chain reaction.
On the face, you see 2004 process tubes, and each one of these process tubes would basically hold 32 fuel elements. So you have a little over 64,000 total fuel elements per reactor.
Each of the fuel elements emits radioactive particles, neutrons, when the reactor is not switched on. This radiation is absorbed by rods made of boron, control rods. At startup, the control rods are withdrawn and the particles emitted by the fuel slugs collide with each other. The result is a chain reaction, and out of the uranium atoms, a completely new material is made, plutonium. This was the theory, but the greatest practical concern was that the chain reaction could be so powerful and generate so much heat that it would trigger a massive explosion. The reactor's engineers needed a way of keeping the reactor cool. The obvious answer was to use the water of the Columbia River.
One of the main reasons this site was selected was the fact that the Columbia was so close by and could provide the water, the massive amounts of water that this machine would need.
You wanted to have a tremendous amount of water flow through the reactor to carry the heat off.
The water was pumped at high pressure through each of the 2004 tubes.
The cooling water actually spent only less than a second from front to back when it flowed down the tubes.
So you're saying this machine would use 27,000 gallons of water in a minute to cool the reactor. That's like filling a swimming pool in 30 seconds.
Right.
When the reactor was finished and ready for use, the plan was to begin cautiously. On September 26, 1944, half of the process tubes were loaded with fuel, and the reactor was started for the first time. The engineers were disappointed. The chain reaction didn't happen as they planned. It looked as if all the resources deployed might have been for nothing. So they took a gamble. They decided to start the reactor at its maximum capacity, with every tube loaded. It was a giant leap of faith, and it was rewarded. B reactor was online, and soon scientists could begin harvesting quantities of the most valuable, most dangerous material on Earth, plutonium. The nuclear age was underway.
I've been allowed to come to this area, the back of the B reactor, an area that members of the public have never seen before. This is the business end of B reactor. Fuel elements that had been loaded on the front face of the reactor had been irradiated for 20-25 days and then were ejected, highly radioactive, into a chute and giant pool of water below. However, with all this technology, all this industrial might, still only 0.1% of all the product coming through these tubes is what the physicists and scientists were looking for. That being plutonium-239.
This was only the start of the procedure. The plutonium still had to be separated from the fuel slugs through a series of highly complex chemical processes. The production of just a few pounds of weapons-grade material generated thousands of tons of lethally toxic waste. But in the dark days of the war, this didn't matter. The U.S. needed the bomb at any price.
In Hanford that you really get a sense of the scope and scale of the Manhattan Project. Producing just a handful of plutonium required hundreds of millions of dollars, enormous production facilities, and the labor of over 100,000 people who had no idea what they were unleashing onto the world.
On August 6, 1945, a uranium-fueled bomb exploded in the skies above Hiroshima. 3 days later, another device obliterated Nagasaki. This was the bomb that ended World War II, and it was made with Hanford plutonium. But Hanford's job wasn't finished. Next, our investigators will discover how, from the pioneering days of the 1940s, the operation here was refined. Hanford would produce enough plutonium for tens of thousands of weapons. Hanford, Washington. Once, it was a vital part of the American military machine. Its landscape is dominated by traces of the lost, hidden city that was once here. Our investigators have found out how the nuclear bomb which fell on Nagasaki was made with plutonium produced at this site. Now, they will discover how, during the Cold War, an entire self-contained world sprang up here. After the end of World War II and the extraordinary achievements of the Manhattan Project, work here was briefly scaled down. But then, a new threat emerged. Beverly Gage talks to local historian Michelle Gerber.
The Second World War comes to an end. What happens to a place like Hanford from then out?
Well, during World War II, 3 reactors were built on the Hanford landscape, but then the Cold War began in 1947. And very quickly, within 8 years, there are 6 more reactors at Hanford. So here you have in the landscape a total of 9 reactors within 12 miles of each other. There's no other place like that on the face of the earth.
As more and more plutonium was needed to fuel the ever-increasing U.S. nuclear arsenal, Hanford, with a powerful Columbia River running through it, was the perfect location for a further series of reactors. Beverly decides to travel up the Columbia River to see for herself the relics of this huge Cold War building boom. This journey would have been impossible 40 years ago. Back then, the whole Hanford site was classified and sealed off from the outside world.
Behind me are the K-West and K-East reactors, part of a new generation of reactors built in the 1950s. As you can see, they are literally the Cold War carved into the American landscape, reactor after reactor. This is a critical site in the ongoing frantic contest over technology, over resources, over productive capacity that was such an important part of the story of the Cold War.
Technology advanced with extraordinary speed. The B reactor of World War II had struggled to produce plutonium for 3 devices. Less than a decade later, 12 reactors supplied enough to make tens of thousands of warheads. Hanford's role was vital to the national interest, and that made it vulnerable.
In the 1950s, as the Soviet nuclear military might began to threaten the U.S., Hanford became a target due to their role in producing the vital nuclear materials for the U.S. arsenal.
No one could be sure of the consequences of an airstrike on Hanford's reactors, but it was clear that defensive measures had to be taken. Michelle Gerber shows David an installation that was last active 40 years ago. With his knowledge of military engineering, David's been able to interpret what he's seen and can describe how this site would function.
I'm standing on top of Nike missile site H-52L. The way this site would work is upon alert, a crew who had been living for 24 hours a day in shifts would have loaded a Nike missile onto an elevator. That elevator would have raised a missile to this level where other crew members would have pushed the missile manually onto a launcher.
In response to the threat of attack from long-range bombers, batteries of these Nike Ajax systems were located at 4 points on the Hanford site. While they were intended to protect the reactors from a devastating attack, they were also assigned that in the Cold War, Hanford stood on the front line. If the order had ever come for the Nike missile to be deployed, a fire control site would track the enemy plane, launch the warhead, and guide it to its target. In the 1950s, this was state-of-the-art technology.
One site here in the Hanford Basin was converted to the Nike Hercules missile. Greater range, faster to target, and most importantly, was tipped with a W-31 nuclear warhead. Ironically, Hanford, which produced the nuclear materials for the U.S. arsenal, was now protected by one of those weapons.
In order to protect the Hanford site, the military was willing to risk an explosion in the skies above it.
John Kennedy said, "We will bear any burden in defense of liberty." Those words would have been meaningless if it hadn't been for force behind those words, and Hanford provided the force.
By the early 1960s, the introduction of intercontinental ballistic missiles had rendered this technology irrelevant. ICBMs flew too high and too fast to be caught in this way. Hanford's Nike missiles were decommissioned. But the site itself continued to grow. By early 1964, it was at full capacity. It employed 45,000 workers across 9 reactors and produced more plutonium than anywhere else on Earth. That came to an end in the 1980s. But Hanford still bears the scars of what it did in the Cold War.
We're making our way past N reactor, which was one of the last reactors built at the Hanford site. 40 years ago, this pumping station would have been bringing in thousands of gallons of water per minute and then pumping them back out into the Columbia River tainted with radioactivity. Today, N-reactor, like all of the other reactors at Hanford, is largely a white elephant, but its legacy lives on in the soil around us and in the water beneath us.
Today, the Hanford complex is the site of the biggest cleanup operation in history. Once again, thousands of people are employed here, this time to try and prevent further contamination of the Columbia River. And yet there are plenty of people who will say that what happened here was necessary, important, and worthwhile.
The Cold War really was a war. It was our nation's most expensive and longest war, and just because it ended in utter silence does not mean that it wasn't significant or decisive in our history. Now, this battlefield at Hanford is as significant as the Gettysburg battlefield, and this place with its Army units and its military production of plutonium put force behind the words of the presidents of those years.
That force took the form of the most destructive energy that the world has ever seen. Next, the place where the power of the atom bomb was first demonstrated, the Nevada test site. A lost world dedicated to the art of destruction, it witnessed more than 900 nuclear tests.
움직이세요. 더 건강한 대한민국을 위해 한국방송광고공사 공익광고협의회
제2차 세계대전 그 누구도 보지 못했던 2차 세계대전의 미공개 컬러 영상
Something's captured on the video.
People are asking now that a mysterious object has been caught on tape over Albany, New York.
And it looked like a missile. So here we had one here goes one there.
Look at this.
3 sets of wings.
Yeah, that's different.
Across America, our investigators have found the traces of nuclear factories, a world of extraordinary engineering built on a vast scale. They've discovered that in the Cold War, the plutonium used to make thousands of bombs was produced at a facility in Hanford, Washington state. Now they've come south, to the place where, 4 decades ago, those devices were tested.
That's exactly the structure.
In 1950, 250 square miles of uninhabited desert northeast of Las Vegas became the Nevada Proving Ground. Many of the early U.S. tests had taken place in the Pacific. But as more and more specific experimentation was required, the long trips out there became impractical. A new location was needed on U.S. soil. Beverly Gage is at the Nevada test site with nuclear weapons designer Joe Martz, a veteran of many top-secret programs here.
We're overlooking the bulk of the Nevada test site behind us. Here, we conducted hundreds of nuclear tests, both underground and in the atmosphere. There are 2 main types of testing that were done here. One was for weapon development, in which you refine the details of the design itself. The other were weapons effects tests, in which you use the weapon to create effects, heat, blast, and shock, that you then subjected to other things, like houses and military hardware, to determine how well they could survive.
In 1951, the Army established Camp Desert Rock, a base for 10,000 soldiers. Their task was to see if there was a place for nuclear weapons on a conventional battlefield. Could they be deployed alongside ground forces? Traces of the exercises conducted here at the test site can still be seen.
Right now, I'm heading down into one of the trenches where several hundred soldiers would have stood in 1955. Why were they here? They would have been crouched down in the trenches to wait for a mushroom cloud to burst. And once it did, as the blast swept over them, it was their job to get up, get out of the trenches, and walk toward it. These were really more psychological tests than they were scientific tests. They were designed to see quite literally whether soldiers would in fact head toward a nuclear explosion. And in the 1950s, this wasn't just a kind of hypothetical exercise. In fact, during the Korean War, there had been lengthy discussions about whether or not this new weapon, this new generation of nuclear weapons, could in fact be used in some way on a conventional battlefield.
On one level, the test was a success. Soldiers did appear willing to walk towards the site of a detonation, and attempts would be made to produce battlefield nuclear weapons. It was clear, however, that the primary purpose of these devices was to deliver destruction across a very wide area. In 1955, the military embarked on a series of tests to observe the effects of nuclear blasts on civilian structures. Journalists were invited to watch. The site of these tests was nicknamed Survival City.
So what we're looking at here then is what remains of one of the houses used in the 1955 test.
Yes, this is called the Apple II house. This was one of the structures built to support a test that was detonated about 1.25 miles in that direction.
The intention was to calculate what would happen if nuclear bombs fell on America. How far would the effects of the blast reach? How would civilian homes hold up?
And it was actually detonated on a tower 500 feet tall at a yield about 1.5 times that of the Hiroshima blast, 29 kilotons.
Wow.
This is typical wooden construction from the 1950s, and the purpose was to define how these structures would survive in the event of a nuclear detonation. You'll notice some of the cabling here.
This is from the 1955 test.
That's right. These were gauges that were put in the house to detect how much the house would move when it was hit by the shock wave from the blast.
In the run-up to the test, Survival City was decked out as the embodiment of All Town, an architectural stunt double for the American way of life. Test mannequins were equipped with JCPenney clothing and arranged in fully furnished living rooms.
So this is a fairly morbid scenario. Take some mannequins, you put them in here as an American family, and then you subject them to a nuclear blast.
Yeah, it is pretty morbid, but the name of the game was survivability in those days. You know, we faced the prospects of a nuclear exchange with the Soviet Union, and it would have been irresponsible not to determine the effects of a nuclear blast on a typical house or population so that we could maximize the chances of survival in the event of the unthinkable.
3, 2, 1, 0.
Those structures within 1 mile of the blast were instantly vaporized. But this house sustained only light damage.
The family that lived here would have survived that nuclear detonation, which is rather remarkable when you think about it. This home was less than 1.25 miles from a 29 kiloton nuclear detonation. And the worst thing that happened here was the chimney was displaced some.
The data gained from these tests was used by the authorities as they made plans for nuclear war.
One of the most important tools developed as a result of tests like this on structures like this were simple analog calculators that were distributed all around the country. So civil defense authorities could calculate both the effects and the potential measures they would have to take to remediate from a nuclear detonation. For example, this home was 6,600 feet from ground zero, a detonation of 29 kilotons. And so we locate the yield, 2,900 kilotons, the range, in this case 2,200 meters. We line those two figures up, and then we can determine that the pressure on the home was 4.5 pounds per square inch, just barely survivable.
We can build a precise picture of what happened that day. The force of the blast was enough to destroy houses and everything else within a 1-mile radius. But this home, an extra half-mile from the detonation point, survived. In 1958, amid growing fears that the local population might suffer from the effects of fallout, the test site was increased in size to 1,370 square miles. The bomb makers were getting better. The bombs were getting bigger. In the northeast corner of the site lies the clearest evidence of a spectacular explosion.
Wow. I have to say, nothing that I've seen in books or in photographs actually prepared me for what it's like to stand here and look at this massive hole. What's going on?
This is the Sedan crater. The purpose of this test was to answer a very basic question. How big a hole can we make with a nuclear weapon? The purposes were peaceful, to do civil engineering, the excavation of harbors or canals with nuclear weapons. This was created by a 105 kiloton detonation. That's about 5 times the size of Hiroshima. It detonated with a force equivalent to over 200 million pounds of explosive. From rim to rim, you're looking at about a 1/4 mile of across, and it's a little more than 300 feet deep.
In this test, the bomb was detonated 600 feet below ground level. As it exploded, it displaced an incredible 11 million tons of earth, throwing boulders the size of cars into the air.
Strangely, this site feels much more menacing than any of the other sites that we've seen. Then it really gives you a sense of how powerful nuclear weapons are. And it also gives you a sense, I think, of just why there was so much growing opposition to above-ground nuclear testing by the late 50s and early 60s. And in fact, by 1963, just a year after this crater was created, there was a full ban on all atmospheric nuclear tests.
This treaty came into effect both to limit the harmful release of radiation and to slow the Cold War arms race. But all over the desert are the remains of the experiments that took place here, each one serving to demonstrate and increase the destructive power of these weapons. Next, our investigators enter a site which was once the deadliest place on Earth. Frozen in time, a missile silo from which, in the event of attack, America was prepared to unleash the most powerful weapon ever built. Our investigators are piecing together a picture of the vast secret world that produced the atomic bomb and armed America throughout the Cold War. They've seen traces of the experiments conducted at the Nevada test site and evidence of the power of a nuclear detonation. Now, industrial engineer David Bradshaw is in Tucson, Arizona. He's entering a facility that is frozen in time. For 20 years, this bunker stood ready to fight the Third World War. In June 1960, the Air Force ordered a new generation of intercontinental ballistic missiles. At the Titan II missile site, David meets historian Chuck Pinson.
Hey David, welcome to 1-7. Great, take a look around.
The missile was to be housed in a silo, a complex of tunnels and control rooms built 150 feet below ground level.
Watch your step and watch for rattlesnakes.
When it was operational, nothing, not even gas or the shock of an earthquake, could get into this site. It was guarded by the best technology available.
Today we're going to enter the blast lock
And the blast lock is protected by 4 6,000-pound doors. Watch your fingers and toes.
So what's the purpose of the blast lock?
The blast lock is a junction between the crew in the control center, the missile in the silo, and the outside world. It kind of connects all three of those pieces. Let me show you where we are in the blueprints here. We came down the access portal right here, and now we're in the blast lock, this area. And precisely, we are between doors 8 and 9 in the blast lock. The long cableway here leads to the silo, right here. And from the other direction, the short cableway leads into the control center, right here.
One of the engineer's top priorities was to avoid at all costs an unintentional or botched missile launch. The silo had to be shielded from any sudden ground movement that might be caused by an earth tremor or an explosion.
One of the most amazing things about this entire complex is that it's shock isolated. What that means is that springs of all shapes and sizes, flexible cables, pistons, spring canisters, and shock absorbers protected the entire complex. Everything was shock-proof, including the simple light bulb.
David has secured special access to all 8 levels of the silo. It's at the lowest level that they get the best understanding of how this weapon worked.
My goodness.
So Chuck, just how big is this thing?
Titan II is 103 feet tall and 10 feet in diameter, and fully loaded with propellant, it weighs 330,000 pounds.
When it was operational, the missile had 3 sections. The top part contained the nuclear warhead. The middle held the main engine and fuel tanks. At the bottom were the rocket engines that would fire the missile out of the silo.
What would occur right here if we lit this thing off?
It would get very hot and really bright all of a sudden. From key turn, what happens is that the 760-ton silo door slides open. The thrust mount springs here and here would lock into place, making this a stable platform.
Yeah.
Sound suppression water roars into the bottom of the silo. That's going to help muffle the roar of the engines when the engines light up.
And that's right below the engine.
That's right. The engine roars to life. A few seconds later, the explosive hold-down bolts fire. Missile is on its way.
So does that process take many minutes?
From key turn to liftoff is 58 seconds.
So much power was unleashed at launch that precautions were taken to preserve the structure of both the silo and the warhead itself.
Titan II engines are so loud that if you light them up and you don't deal with it somehow, the roar of the engines could actually shake the missile apart. So to avoid that, engineers lined the entire inside of the launch duct with these acoustical tiles. They're like the ones in your office ceiling, only they're about 1 foot thick and they're made of fiberglass inside covered with this aluminum facing. And this is designed to literally soak up the sound of the engines and prevent the sound from damaging the missile.
David wants to find out exactly how the launch procedure worked. He meets former crew commander Yvonne Morris.
I was stationed here from 1980 to 1984. I was on a combat crew, a Titan II missile combat crew, and our job was to keep the site operational.
In her time here, Yvonne would have been personally responsible for any missile launch.
This is the Launch Control Center, and from here the crew has a bird's eye view of everything that's going on around the site.
Strict security protocols meant that no crew member could operate alone in any part of the complex.
It takes 2 keys to launch the missile.
So how does that work?
Well, if you go over there to the left of that clock and underneath it.
Here?
Yes.
Right here?
Yeah, that's the Deputy Crew Commander's launch key. You have to turn your key at the same time that I turn my key in order to initiate the launch sequence.
Now, you would give me the command and then we would work together to turn keys at the same time.
That's exactly what we do.
And clearly I can't reach both keys because they're too far apart.
Strategic Air Command had its kind of a philosophy, 2 inputs for 1 output. 2 keys, 1 launch.
The order to launch would have come from Central Command in the form of a code. But as Yvonne demonstrates, the launch procedure depended on the actions of just 2 individuals.
Ready? 3, 2, 1, turn, 5, 4, 3, 2, release. Okay, we've now started something that we can't stop. Launch enable means we have the right code in the butterfly valve lock. When APS power lights, that's going to mean that the missile is on its own internal power. The silo closure door has started to open, but we can't see that down here. After that, the thrust mount ring is locked. The propellants are going to come together in the stage 1 engine. We're going to get fire in the engine, and we're going to get a klaxon letting us know that we've got a huge fire in the launch duct. And then we're going to get liftoff. 25 minutes from now, target 2 is a smoking hole.
Once the missile had left the silo, there would be nothing the crew could do to halt it. Within minutes, it would be traveling at more than 16,000 miles per hour. But the order to launch never came. Today, the missile is decommissioned and stands as a tourist attraction. It is a reminder of America's permanent state of readiness throughout the Cold War.
This is the end product of our country's military-industrial complex. A 9-megaton warhead, a hydrogen bomb on the tip of a missile, capable of being delivered 5,500 miles away with the accuracy of just a few city blocks, capable of destroying nearly 900 square miles.
As the Cold War drew to a close, these structures were no longer deemed necessary. All the other Titan II sites were destroyed in accordance with arms reduction treaties. The reactors at the Hanford complex halted their production of weapons-grade plutonium. A worldwide ban ended nuclear testing in Nevada. But all over America, the remains of this program can still be found. They are the legacy of the greatest arms race of all time. 40 years when the world faced the threat of sudden and total destruction.